I'm so glad you could join us today as we gather together to remember the cross. Our tendency as Christians is to focus on Sunday. But in order for us to experience the joy of Sunday, we have to go through the agony of Friday. And that's what the purpose of this service is to focus on the cross and what Christ has done on our behalf.
Friday started early for the one who had been arrested in the garden late Thursday evening. Actually, Thursday never ended. It just melded into the early hours of Friday morning as the soldiers pushed and pulled the man called Jesus along the way to the court of Caiaphas.
It was Caiaphas who pompously presided over a mock trial filled with false witnesses, and the lead prosecutor who worked diligently to trap Jesus into some kind of confession. Confessing what? No one was really sure of. Finally, Caiaphas declared him guilty, followed by more taunts and hideous laughter and humiliation. Near daybreak, the council voted unanimously their sentence: death. But after all the shenanigans, realizing they had no real authority, they ordered Jesus to be tied again and sent him to the Roman courthouse of Pontius Pilate, the governor.
Just after daylight, Friday morning, Jesus arrived in the court of one Pontius Pilate. He was weakening. He'd had nothing to eat and no sleep. Pilate, not wanting to deal with a petty Jewish problem and seeing that Jesus really didn't offer any defense towards his accusers, decided to pass him off to Herod, the Jewish magistrate. Pilate didn't really like Herod, but he knew he was in town for Passover. So this was his chance to get rid of Jesus, just like Caiaphas had tried to pass him off to him.
But Herod wasn't in the mood either. And after asking him a couple of questions and getting nothing from the accused, he offered his pronouncement: "He's not my problem. Take this king back to Pilate." And the soldiers, making fun of him, dressed Jesus in one of Herod's old robes and took him back to the governor. And the prisoner was pushed and pulled by chains that constrained him back into the Roman courtroom.
Yeah.
When Pilate saw Jesus walk in with his accusers, he called the chief priests and elders aside and said, "Look, guys, you brought this man to me before. You presented your case, I examined him, and I frankly don't find that he's broken any laws." And obviously, Herod agrees. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give him a warning, a slap on the wrist, and send him on his way. I've got more important things to do.
But when the crowd which had been following, and which had grown considerably by this time, got wind outside that Pilate was going to release Jesus, they went berserk. And knowing that Pilate had a custom of releasing a prisoner during their Passover feast, someone in the crowd suggested,
"If you're going to release someone, release Barabbas." A murmur went over the crowd, and someone began to chant, "Release Barabbas, release Barabbas." And soon the whole crowd was chanting, "Release Barabbas, release Barabbas."
Now, Barabbas was a notorious criminal, a murderer, and insurrectionist, and so Pilate beckoned the crowd. "If I release Barabbas, what do you want me to do with this one you call King of the Jews?"
and the crowd cried out, "Crucify him!"
Now Pilate, a politician for sure, but a man of some integrity, was confused that the crowd would want to kill one who in his eyes had done virtually nothing and would want a hardened criminal turned loose on the streets of the city. So he asked again,
"Why? What has he done?"
But the crowd only grew louder. "Crucify Jesus! Crucify him!" Now Pilate, feeling boxed into a corner and fearing this scene was going to turn into a full-fledged riot, ordered Barabbas, the murderer, released, and ordered that Jesus of Nazareth be condemned to die, executed on a cross.
The soldiers immediately dragged the condemned into the praetorium. He cried out, and his voice echoed around the stone walls as they dragged him by the hair, beat him with reeds, and kicked and punched him until his body was swollen and bruised. They stripped off his clothes, put the regal robe on him again, put a crown that some had made out of thorns on his head, and put one of the reeds in his hand, as if a scepter. Then, as they laughed at him, they knelt down before him, mocking him, and with voices reeking with sarcasm, shouted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they laughed again. They spat on him, took the reed from his hand, and beat it against his head. Then they ripped the purple robe from his body, put his own clothes, or what was left of them, back on, and led him away to die, to be crucified.
And Pilate watched with mouth gaping amazement at the fury of the crowd, many of whom didn't even really know Jesus, much less know anything he'd done.
And they still cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" And so they did. The purple robe of mocked royalty was ripped from his back, and his own peasant's tunic was quickly pulled over his head. He would wear it for a short time on the longest walk of his life. 2 soldiers pushed him hard toward the double wooden doors that opened onto a crowded and noisy Jerusalem street. Jesus had no sooner cleared the opening when a heavy wooden beam was hoisted onto his shoulders. He would bear it to Golgotha, and then it would bear him. The weight upon his shoulders, staggering as it was to a man so harshly treated over the past 12 hours, was nothing compared to the burden that would be his within the hour.
The crowd parted as if a knife had opened a way for this horrific procession. The sound of shouts and taunts of those who never knew him mingled with the wails and cries of those who did. He had barely traveled 100 feet when his body gave way under the weight of the cross. One soldier kicked and prodded and cursed, trying to get him back on his feet. Another quickly scanned the crowd, spotted Simon of Cyrene, glared at him, and motioned authoritatively for him to step out. "Take this cross," he growled. With all his strength, Simon relieved Jesus of his burden for a time. Jesus caught his breath and slowly rose to his feet. A murmured blessing was sent Simon's way, and the journey continued.
Golgotha. The name means skull. It was the place of execution, of suffering, of death. And it was Jesus' destination. When the entourage arrived, the action was quick, precise, practiced, professional. 2 soldiers muscle a prisoner to the ground and stretch his arms across a beam. The first one struggles, but a couple of other soldiers join the fray and subdue him quickly, sitting on him as the spiker performs his duty. The victim screams as the iron spikes impact the wrist. 2 wraps on one arm, 2 more wraps on the other.
Having witnessed this, the second prisoner struggles even more desperately, but the soldiers soon have him in hand as well. 2 wraps on one arm, 2 more on the other.
Then the soldiers moved to Jesus. They saved him for last. His tunic is removed from his body. His loincloth is stripped away. 2 men stretch the Lord's arms across the coarse-grained wooden beam. Another straddles his chest. 2 more hold tightly to his legs. They brace themselves for the last fitful act of resistance to which they are so accustomed. But strangely, this man throws no fit. offers no resistance.
The spiker takes his place in the ritual. He reaches into his leather apron that bulges with nails. A 7-inch spike is placed cold against Jesus' right wrist, just below the hand. One powerful, well-struck blow of the heavy iron-headed mallet drives the nail through Jesus' arm. A second blow penetrates the wooden beam. Moments later, the ritual is repeated.
Then, one by one, the crossbeams are raised into position. 4 members of the execution squad lift the crossbeam that bears the body of Jesus. 2 others steady his feet, and 2 more hoist it with ropes that run through a groove in the upright timber that stood waiting for its load. The spikes scrape against the bones in Jesus' wrist. The shifting weight of his body tears both skin and muscle. But still, he does not cry out. The moan is buried deep in his chest.
The crossbeam is steadied into a notch on the upright. The further jostling of the beams scrape the open wound on Jesus' back, the remains of the scourging he had endured only hours before. The pain is excruciating, and there is no anesthetic. The bored holes in each beam are aligned, and a peg is driven through both to join the timbers. Once the crossbeam is secure, his right leg is pulled over the left, and the spiker drives a single nail through both feet. Jesus winces deeply in the pain, and then opens his eyes to see the spiker and a few other soldiers standing around admiring their work.
Crucifixion was a borrowed practice. The Persians apparently invented it, but the Romans developed it to an art form. They reserved it for the most despised of criminals. Revolutionaries like these 3, they refused to use it against any of their own citizens.
The victim of crucifixion did not die quickly. Sometimes it took days. Death did not come from the wounds, Their purpose was merely to add to the pain. Suffering was intense and lengthy. Besides the work of gravity pulling the body against the bones and nerves of the wrists and ankles, the victim also often experienced a dislocation of his shoulders. Sometimes death came from exposure to the elements. At other times, the victim simply suffocated as he lost the ability to endure the pain of pushing with his feet into a position where he could fill his lungs with air. No more shameful, painful means of death existed.
7 times our Lord spoke during the next 6 hours. When every word is accompanied by unimaginable agony, they are spoken carefully. Once he spoke a prayer to ask forgiveness for the very men who had driven nails into his flesh and who would curse him in his agony. These men had heard many things uttered from the crosses they had erected, but never anything like this. The words pierced them. "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing."
The mockery of the cross was intensified in every imaginable way. Over Jesus' head hung the ironic declaration, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." That was Pilate's way of saying, this is what Rome does to those who would challenge her authority. Like the 2 on crosses beside him, Jesus was executed for revolution, a crime he never committed. But it was around that charge that the assault on Jesus was sustained.
If you're the Messiah, the Son of God, come down from the cross, save yourself. Even the 2 revolutionaries at his right and left joined in the verbal attack on Jesus.
What irony! Of course he was the Messiah, but not in any way of these were prepared to understand. He was the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Of course he was the King of Israel, but his kingdom was not of this world. Of course he had the power to summon legions of angels to his side, any one of which would have been more than a match for the entire Roman army. But he could not save himself without abandoning his mission. And so he endured the words.
But there came a change in the heart of one who hung by Jesus' side. A revolutionary giving his life for his ideals and hatred of Rome saw something in Jesus he had never seen before. He saw someone dying in love rather than in hatred. He didn't understand much, but he understood enough. He knew that in some sense, Jesus was the king. He grasped in some measure that Jesus' kingdom was not of this world. He understood to some degree that Jesus might be willing to include him in that kingdom. If this man hanging next to me prayed for the forgiveness of these cursed soldiers, perhaps his own forgiveness was a possibility. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise.
as he continued to hang on the cross. Among those gathered was a dear friend to whom he entrusted the care of Mary, his mother. She stood at the foot of the cross and watched her son die. She had endured the pain of his coming into the world, and now an unimaginable pain gripped her heart as she watched him leaving it.
To her, the cross must have looked like the hilt of a sword plunged into the heart of the earth. Perhaps she recalled those puzzling words spoken to her by an old man in the temple 33 years earlier. This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too.
Was this the sword Simeon has spoken of? She saw more clearly now what it meant for him to be about his Father's work. John, the beloved disciple, took Mary into his care from that painful hour.
3 hours passed, and Jesus' suffering continued, and then increased. How could anything have intensified the pain that for 3 hours seemed to penetrate every cell in his body?
The noonday brightness of the spring day suddenly disappeared. It was as though nature itself could not bear the sight. It was as though the great light that illuminated the world was being extinguished. It was as though light were no longer appropriate.
But to Jesus, it was as though his loneliness and agony deepened a millionfold. He cried out the deep disappointment and grief. My God, why have you forsaken me?" To the Father, it was as if he had wrapped the heavens in sackcloth as evidence of his own pain. Three more hours of the horror crept slowly by. The crowds made their way home in the darkness. Only his mother and a few friends remained alongside the soldiers to witness the end. It was all he could do to endure, to breathe. His eyes were swollen nearly shut, his tongue thick, his mouth dry. And in the darkness, the silence was even deeper.
Then, around 3 o'clock, he spoke. It was only a single word spoken with a thin, raspy voice. It was a request, his first for himself. Thirsty. What irony. He who had invited all of us with thirsty lives to come to him and drink now calls on sinful man to moisten his parched lips. And the one who had changed water into wine is now offered a sponge soaked in the bitter vintage of human sin.
But even that request for relief wasn't purely selfish. Jesus received the drink in order to speak two more simple but profound sentences. First, a simple prayer. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And in simple childlike faith and trust, Jesus prepared to enter paradise.
The final words he spoke bore an ironic twist as well. It is finished. On paper, it reads like despair. Life is over. Suffering is over. I've been defeated. But that is not how it was spoken. 3 gospel writers declare that Jesus died with a shout or a loud cry, but John, the eyewitness, heard fulfillment in the cry. It is finished. The mission is accomplished. The Father has been revealed. Darkness has been defeated. The serpent's head has been crushed. The debt has been paid. Nothing else remains.
Then he died. Like every other human being who has ever walked the earth, he died. Respiration ceased. His heart did not beat. The brain ceased to function. Limbs grew limp. His eyes set and glazed over. He died. One moment he was there, and then he was not.
When they crucified my Lord, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to that tree? Were you there when they nailed him to that tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?